Police and security guards in Belgium were caught flat-footed today by a cowardly sneak attack on one of the world's wealthiest men. The target was Microsoft Chairman Bill Gates, arriving for a meeting with community leaders. Watch what happens when a team of hitmen meet him first with a pie in the face. Gates was momentarily and understandably shaken, but he was not injured. The hit squad piled on with 2 more pies before one of them was wrestled to the ground and arrested. The others, for at least the moment, got away. Gates went inside, wiped his face clean, and made no comment. He then went ahead with his scheduled meeting. No word on the motive for this attack.
This world is not what you think it is. This world is not what you think it is.
In my lifetime, this will be the greatest economic hit. But you don't have a choice. People act like you have a choice. People don't feel like going to the stadium when they might get infected. You know, it's not the government who's saying, okay, just ignore this disease. And, you know, people are deeply affected by seeing these deaths, by knowing they could be part of the transmission chain. And, you know, old people, their parents, their grandparents could be affected by this. And so you don't get to say, ignore what's going on here. There will be the ability, particularly in rich countries, to open up if things are done well over the next few months. But for the world at large, normalcy only returns when we've largely vaccinated the entire global population.
The entire population.
Bill Gates is often described as a philanthropist. Interviewers generally seem to treat him as a cross between a saint and a prophet. And in a way, this isn't difficult to explain. After all, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a partner with many media companies, tossing money around with remarkable generosity. In the UK, both the BBC and The Guardian are just 2 of the recipients of the Gates largesse. It would, of course, have been possible for Gates to have used his vast wealth to change poor countries in a very straightforward and positive way, for example, by using his billions to help with massive road building programs, or helping poor farmers to improve their land and their farms by digging wells, using $10 billion to set up water supplies would have been doubtless saved many lives in a simple, honest way. But you can't control the world quite so easily by doing practical, honest things which save lives. And Gates seems to me to be keen to control every aspect of our life. To me, he seems to be a strange hybrid of those mad fictional characters Dr. Strangelove and Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the James Bond baddie. I'm afraid I don't believe any of Gates's projects have anything much to do with philanthropy. There's too much intermixing of donations and business. What do the Gates family really want? I can't help feeling it's more about power and unspoken plans. Gates got rich through the Microsoft software company, allegedly because his mom knew the chairman of IBM and got young Gates his break. There are accusations that Gates stole some of the ideas for his business. Personally, I feel that Gates has made himself obscenely rich by making the world a far more stressful and annoying place than it was before Microsoft appeared. In my experience, there were other much easier to use processing programs, but Gates steamrolled the opposition out of the way with ruthless efficiency. Gates's original partner, Paul Allen, claimed that Gates tried to screw him and charged his partner with mercenary opportunism. Before Gates arrived on the scene, people who wrote software often gave it away free. Gates took over the world of personal computing, acquired a monopoly position, and took full advantage of it to make himself very rich. And additionally, there have for some time in my mind been doubts about how close Microsoft is to the National Security Agency in the USA. The Microsoft billionaire seems to have learnt his hometown boy act from veteran investor Warren Buffett. who didn't get to be as rich as he is by being a hometown boy, but has a good line in simple charm. Gates has described himself as a health expert and frequently offers advice and predictions about health matters, though personally I'd have thought his only area of real expertise with viruses involved those usually found in computers. He has stated that the world will not return to normal after the coronavirus until all or most of the world's population has been vaccinated. Because he has a lot of money and tends to distribute it widely, politicians and bureaucrats and scientists listen to his advice and accept what he tells them, parroting his line about vaccination with great loyalty. It would, I think, normally be unusual for a bloke with no formal medical training to give health advice to the world, but Gates has managed to buy himself a seat at the table by giving huge sums of money to organisations such as the United Nations and the World Health Organization. In my own view, two of the most evil organisations in the world. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is said to be the second largest contributor to the World Health Organization. And if the United States really does stop its donations, then Gates will be the biggest contributor. That sort of money buys a lot of access and, I think, an unhealthy amount of influence, especially when you also spend a good deal of money on publicity designed to show the world what a good egg you are. Gates is also linked to the World Economic Forum, which reckons that the coronavirus is a great excuse to change the world, and which has a plan called the Great Reset, which, like most of these plans which have emerged since the coronavirus, seems to me to have been prepared some time before the arrival of COVID-19. Gates, of course, also gives a good deal of money to Imperial College in London, the place where Neil Ferguson works. It was, of course, Ferguson whose rubbishy forecasts about the coronavirus resulted in the lockdowns, the social distancing, the ruin of the British and American economies, untold deaths in care homes, and so on. Gates has also funded work done by Dr. Chris Whitty, the UK's current Chief Medical Officer, and the Gates Foundation has even given money to Public Health England, a UK government organisation sponsored by the Department of Health, which allegedly exists to protect and improve the nation's health. Public Health England appears to be desperately keen on vaccinations, which is a big surprise, of course. One of their documents carries the slogan, "Keep calm and carry on vaccinating," which seems more than a little cheesy to me, to say the least. Before I go any further, it's important to point out and bear in mind that Gates believes the planet is overpopulated. He thinks this is a real problem. He used to believe in eugenics, we're told, but he seems to have gone a bit quiet about that in recent years. Is it still a secret passion? Was it ever? Who knows? Interviewers, who often seem to come from organisations with financial links to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, rarely ask searching questions about difficult issues. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is an odd organisation in that, as well as having philanthropic aims, it also invests in a good many companies designed to make a profit. Indeed, the foundation seems to me to be doing very well, and it seems almost to operate as much like a family investment trust as a charity. The Gates Foundation has a mass of interlinked projects and commercial holdings, and it seems to an innocent outsider as though he's more interested in controlling the world than in helping people. Here are just a few of the things Gates is currently doing with his money. First, of course, there are the vaccines. I've already dealt with some of the controversies associated with the Gates obsession with vaccines in previous videos. Gates does seem obsessed with vaccines and now seems to favour ones using very new technology. He is terrifyingly keen on giving his experimental vaccine to billions of people, ideally to the whole population of the planet. It doesn't seem to occur to him that even relatively safe vaccines have been known to cause many thousands of deaths, might enhance susceptibility to disease, and indeed cause and spread infections. If it has occurred to him, it doesn't seem to be something that worries him unduly. On the surface, Gates seems to see vaccination as the answer to most of the planet's health problems and sees them as only doing good and incapable of doing very much harm. We're not going to return to normal until most people have been vaccinated, he has said, after warning that the coronavirus would otherwise result in millions of deaths. You will never be free until we have a vaccine, seems to be the mantra. Naturally, the politicians and the scientists agree with the man with the money, even though experts seem to agree that a vaccine may never be found. If no vaccine is found, then much of the world will remain in a state of terror, and social distancing and masks and occasional lockdowns will become a normal part of life. Is that what Gates wants? The politicians and the big business people with a yearning for control will be delighted. Moreover, Gates seems to have decided that we won't have a vaccine for 18 months. And naturally, the world's politicians and scientists, many of whom are on the Gates payroll, agree with the world's least qualified but most powerful doctor. So it seems that the artificial lockdowns and the unnecessary social distancing and the masks will remain in place. Incidentally, I usually avoid the words vaccine and vaccination because they tend to result in censorship. On this occasion, however, it seems impossible to do so. Since Gates is convinced that the planet is overpopulated, it seems odd that he would be keen on vaccinating huge swathes of Africa. You might think that vaccinating children would mean that there'd be fewer deaths and that the population would go up, at least if Gates's predictions are accurate. But Gates argues that if you vaccinate children and they don't die, then mothers will have fewer babies, and instead of having 8 babies in the hope that 2 will live, they'll just have 3, believing that the vaccines will keep them alive. I'm not at all sure how this means that vaccination will result in a fall in the population, but Gates says it will, and the politicians and the scientists and the journalists all nod wisely, pat their wallets, and agree with him. I haven't been able to find any real solid evidence for this claim, which seems to me to be a combination of the bizarre and the unbelievable, laced with wishful thinking, apart from the evidence from Gates himself, of course. I don't like to point this out, but religion seems to play a part in the number of children a woman has. In the UK, for example, the figures show that Muslims tend to have on average 3 children per family, whereas Christians usually have only 2. There are, of course, those who are concerned that Gates's mass vaccination program is part of his plan to reduce the world's population to 500 million or so, a figure that many who are keen on population control regard as acceptable. Personally, I can't see the difference between an untested vaccine used globally and genocide, but then I'm perhaps a little old-fashioned in liking to see drugs and vaccines properly tested before being rolled out to large populations. And although interviewers rarely seem to mention it, there are some very worrying stories circulating about some of the vaccination programs promoted by Gates and or the World Health Organization. These are not, however, worries that get aired in those parts of the media supported by grants and partnerships from the Gates Foundation. I allow absolutely no advertising or sponsorship on my videos or website, but great chunks of the media, popular and specialist, seem to enjoy close financial links with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it's important to remember this. I've no doubt that many websites are also given money or support by the foundation. I'll deal with Bill Gates' obsession with vaccines in the second part of this 2-part series entitled Just a Little Prick. But there are many other topics which must first be mentioned. First, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has invested in a company called Monsanto. I have always regarded Monsanto as the most evil company on the planet, and I've thought of it this way for several reasons. First, Monsanto has long been a leader in the development of genetically modified plants. These terrify me because, as far as I've been able to find out, they've never been properly tested to see what long-term consequences there might be. What damage could there be to crops in a few years' time? Could they become more susceptible to disease? And are there any risks to people who eat genetically modified food? For some years now, Monsanto has taken to patenting its seeds, and as a result, small farmers who've traditionally grown their crops from their own seeds have found they've been unable to do so. There are said to have been many thousands of suicides as a result of this, as farmers found that they weren't allowed to grow the seed they'd saved from their own crops, but they had to buy seeds they couldn't afford to buy. I've reported on this many times in the past. And of course Monsanto is the manufacturer of Roundup, a doubtless effective but equally doubtless nasty weed killer. Unfortunately, there have been a number of claims that Roundup causes cancer, and there were 125,000 lawsuits as a result. The German company Bayer bought Monsanto a little while ago. Bayer is alleged to have paid $63 billion for Monsanto and to have paid $10.9 billion to settle the claims relating to Roundup. Bayer, now the new owner of Monsanto, has an interesting history, which is worth a short detour while we're here. Think of this as our equivalent of a side trip to Barnard Castle. In 1925, a group of important German companies, which included Bayer, formed a cartel called IG Farben. Their aim was to obtain control of global markets in key industrial sectors, specifically chemicals, pharmaceuticals and petrochemicals. History shows quite clearly that it was the formation of this cartel and the creation of IG Farben which led directly to the Second World War and all its associated atrocities, and ultimately the European Union. IG Farben's need for cheap labour was so great that the company built a huge factory at Auschwitz, where there was a large reservoir of slave labour. Bayer, the company's pharmaceutical division, tested its drugs on prisoners. IG Farben also made huge amounts of money by providing the gas for the killing of prisoners in concentration camps throughout Germany. At the end of the Second World War, IG Farben was broken up into 4 new companies, one of which was Bayer, and all of Farben's assets, including the profits from manufacturing the gas used in the infamous gas chambers, were transferred to the new companies, all of which were managed and run by the people who had run IG Farben. So the bottom line was that although IG Farben had been run by war criminals, no one was really punished, and things had carried on much as they had during the war. The only thing that changed was that a good deal of company notepaper had to be redesigned and freshly printed. The new companies denied any responsibilities for the actions of IG Farben on the basis that they were new and hadn't existed during the war. This disgraceful self-serving legal move was accepted without a murmur of protest. Bayer, which had been part of IG Farben, had used concentration camp victims for its experiments and for testing new drugs, but the company was allowed to keep all the profits from these experiments. By the mid-60s, Bayer had become ever richer and more powerful. And there seemed to be no shame about the past. Bayer actually set up a foundation to honour a Nazi called Fritz Termeer on his 80th birthday and started the foundation off with a donation of 2 million Deutschmarks. It wasn't until 20 years later that Bayer changed the name of the foundation. It didn't seem to bother anyone that Herr Termeer had overseen the building of IG Auschwitz and had been found guilty of war crimes, including genocide, and sentenced to just 7 years imprisonment in 1948. Naturally, he didn't serve the full sentence. Fritz Termeer, one of the most evil Nazis, was released in 1950 and immediately rejoined the board of Bayer. That's the end of the detour. Will Bayer be making a coronavirus vaccine or treatment? Who knows? Would you want it if they did? The bottom line is that I cannot imagine why anyone who really cares for people and the planet would put any money into Monsanto or Bayer. Many investors try to avoid what they think of as dirty companies who do or have done bad things to people or the environment, but this doesn't seem to bother Gates. And oddly enough, I haven't been able to find any evidence that interviewers from The Guardian or the BBC have asked Gates whether he's comfortable with his investment in a company widely regarded as worse than wicked. Have I mentioned, by the way, that both the BBC and The Guardian are partners with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? By which I mean they've received money from the foundation. That, of course, is the sanctimonious Guardian newspaper, which was founded with the aid of money from slavery. Next, Gates has been funding scientists at Harvard who are trying to block out the sun's rays in an attempt to stop global warming. If you haven't heard of this before, just stop and think for a moment. The scientists want to spray millions of tons of dust into the stratosphere to stop the sun's rays reaching the Earth. One plan is that every day more than 800 large aircraft would lift millions of tons of chalk dust to a height of 12 miles above the Earth and then sprinkle the dust to stop the sun's rays getting through. Another plan is to send up hot air balloons to release powder into the atmosphere. There are, you won't be surprised to hear, a couple of problems with this. Obviously the first is that no one has yet proved that global warming is taking place and is any more, if it's any more than a natural phenomenon. Moreover, there are a lot of scientists who believe that we're heading into a phase where the planet is actually cooling. Is it really a coincidence that the Americans and the Chinese are busy building icebreakers? Would they do that if they thought the ice was all melting because the Earth was getting hotter? And there are those who think that the scientists and the Gates money and the people throwing powder into the sky could help create droughts, hurricanes and mass deaths. It seems fairly well agreed that altering the atmosphere to cool the planet could have unpredictable effects. In 1815, a volcanic eruption created crop shortages and disease outbreaks. Some might say, of course, that all this could be considered a bonus by a man who wants to reduce the world population. No one seems to have told him, by the way, that 800 large aircraft taking off every day and flying to 12 miles up would require a good deal of aviation fuel. And what sort of dust are they planning to have sprayed? Well, some say calcium, but I've also heard talk of barium, strontium, alumina. Whatever it is won't improve the quality of the air we breathe. The bottom line is this seems to me to be a way to reduce the world's population rather than protect it, all in the guise of dealing with the climate change hoax. Next, Gates is funding scientists at a company which is genetically modifying mosquitoes. This project has received authority in the United States, and the genetically modified mosquitoes will be released in 2022. What could go wrong? I have no idea. I don't think anyone else does either. But I can think of a number of good reasons why this is breathtakingly dangerous. There's even talk of research into mosquito-delivered vaccines. Gates is also helping to pay for researchers who are making breast milk from cultured mammary cells. This seems to me to be the ultimate in hubris. Why does Gates always want to interfere with nature? The female body produces the perfect breast milk. There's no need for substitutes. I remember that when attempts were made to introduce powdered milk into developing countries, it was a disaster. Women were told to stop natural breastfeeding and to follow the example set by Western women and to use artificial milk. One problem was that the water used to rehydrate the milk was often badly polluted and many babies died. If Gates wants to help women and babies, he would surely do better to encourage natural breastfeeding. You will by now see a pattern developing. Gates seems to me to be a mad scientist marquee. He seems to have massive faith in the idea that scientists can solve everything by interfering with nature, often using global warming as an excuse for his plans. His attitude seems to me to be that he knows much better than God how things should work, and so he's going to use his money to pay for the improvements he thinks we need. Next, Gates is funding the development of fake meat. This will be very handy when his other projects, such as blocking the sunshine, destroys traditional farming. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funds the Cornell Alliance for Science, which supports the agri-chemical industry. All this takes the power from small farmers and gives it to big chemical companies, in my opinion. If Gates's projects damage natural farming, then his foundation's investments in laboratory food and artificial breast milk will doubtless prove to be extremely profitable. Gates, through his foundation, has also invested in microchipped biomedical track and trace and payment transaction systems such as cryptocurrencies. He seems to prefer digital payment systems to old-fashioned cash and appears to be enthusiastic about ID systems and health passports, which he has described as being good for keeping an eye on people, making sure they pay their taxes and have their Gates-approved vaccinations. I think it's fair to say he's probably rather more enthusiastic about transhumanism than I am. And then there's the organisation known as ID 2020, which is believed by some to show more than modest enthusiasm for mandatory vaccination programmes and mandatory track and tracing programmes. Since 2016, ID 2020 has promoted digital ID. The promoters or partners are Microsoft, company which made Gates rich, and Gavi, the alliance which links drug companies and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among others. One of the Gates Foundation's aims is, of course, investing in vaccine development and surveillance. It's exciting, they say, to imagine a world where safe and secure digital identities are possible, providing everyone with an essential building block to every right and opportunity they deserve. Close quotes. If I trusted Bill Gates, I might be a little more enthusiastic, but I'd rather ask Donald Trump to hold my wallet than ask Bill Gates to hold my identity. Gates and or his foundation or Microsoft have also invested in OnFido, which is preparing technology to develop a phone app to scan faces so that people can work or travel. And I doubt if Gates would object to the suggestion that we all have medical certificates vaccinated into our bodies to prove that we've had the COVID-19 vaccination. What else is there? Well, there's the Pirbright Institute, where they study infectious diseases affecting farm animals. The Pirbright Institute is one of those curious hybrid organisations which is government funded but also a charity, and as you've probably guessed, its major stakeholders include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I was a little surprised to find Gates supporting an institute researching farm animals until I discovered that the Pirbright Institute had taken out a patent on a coronavirus with the European Patent Office. Big companies do a lot these days, and it seems institutes do too. I wondered why anyone would want a patent on the coronavirus, though of course the patent might be useful for a vaccine. And there's something called CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. This was launched in Davos in 2017 by the governments of Norway and India, the Wellcome Trust, the World Economic Forum, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's been given large chunks of taxpayer money from Germany, Australia, and the UK. One of CEPI's goals is the development of platforms which can be used for rapid vaccine development against unknown pathogens. One of the board voting members is somebody from the vaccine business unit at Takeda Pharmaceutical Company. And the scientific advisory committee includes someone from Pfizer, of course, and CEPI and GlaxoSmithKline have announced a collaboration, which is nice, and CEPI works in partnership with Imperial College, which is where Ferguson works and where work is being done on vaccines. You'll remember Ferguson. It was his outrageously wrong prediction which led to the lockdowns and the social distancing and the desperate call for a vaccine to end all our misery. Oh, and CEPI also works with Gavi, which we'll come to in part 2 of Just a Little Prick. Gavi has announced its enthusiasm for identifying and registering children around the world. Just how Gates, the world's leading expert on health, keeps up with all these organisations is beyond me. I wouldn't know whether I was at a CEPI meeting or a Gavi meeting, or simply in the counting house counting out my money. But I expect our wonderful billionaire has lots of help, and there's always Mrs. Gates, of course. Gates, through his foundation, has bought support and influence everywhere, but he has, in my view, left a trail of damage and concern. And all that brings us back to the vaccines, of course. No story about Gates would be complete without details of the vaccines, past and future. I'll deal with Mr. and Mrs. Gates' obsession with vaccines in the next part of this two-part series. It's an obsession which seems to me to be distinctly unhealthy, though perhaps not for Bill and Melinda. I don't think it's too healthy for people in developing countries, and it's probably not going to be healthy for those of us in developed countries either. When asked when we would get back to normal after the coronavirus hoax, Gates said, "When almost every person on the planet has been vaccinated against coronavirus." He has colourfully described the vaccine for COVID-19 as the final solution. Inconveniently, many experts say it may not be possible to make a vaccine. Some point out that making a vaccine often takes many years. And I am not the only doctor to worry that if a vaccine is made very quickly with inadequate testing, then the global consequences could be absolutely catastrophic. Injecting 7 billion people with an experimental vaccine sounds to me like a potential recipe for a disaster previously unknown on the planet. In his less bombastic moments, Gates realizes this and has therefore insisted that there be indemnification for those making and distributing vaccines. In other words, if the vaccine kills you or destroys your brain, then you're on your own. Don't expect any compensation. In the US, manufacturers and distributors have had immunity from February 2020. I'm not sure whether the immunity will cover doctors and nurses, so that's something they might like to worry about. Patients should see my video entitled Advice for Anyone Not Wanting to be Stuffed. Part 2 of this series gets even more extraordinary, and watch it soon just in case it gets removed and mysteriously disappears.
You know, is there something to worry about with medicines? That is, might some of them have side effects? Do we need safety testing? I mean, and we're taking things that are, genetically modified organisms, and we're injecting them in little kids' arms. We just shoot them right into the vein.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to this nightly broadcast. I'm your top anchor, Dickie Richard. Tonight's special guest is the second largest donor to the World Health Organization. He's none other than Bill Gates. So, Bill, do you think we as a society will fundamentally change once all of this is over?
Well, I do think that this is an excellent time for growth and the compulsory implementation for digital certificates to show who's been tested and also who has recovered. Also, it'll show who hasn't taken our vaccine. Once we get those out, we can see the areas that are most impacted. And thank goodness for the internet's capacity that we can all grow, learn together, and connect with one another. We're all interdependent.
So, Bill, you've previously made comments that cause concern. I'll give you an opportunity to address the conspiracy theories. But first, let's roll the clip.
First, we've got population. Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
We could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
Well, that's the thing. I find it ironic that people would attack someone spending billions of dollars on tools that our models show an upward spike in the population, for which our foundation is offering aggressive reproductive health to women in poverty-stricken areas to prevent whole generations from, let's say, being born, which in turn will reduce the emission levels in the world and create a more hospitable global habitat for humanity.
I will be honest, Bill, that answer did not make things any better for you. But what is your response to the president seeming to suggest that we inject disinfectants? That would be a plausible cure for this COVID.
And that's just the thing. It isn't safe to inject yourself with any disinfectant that I haven't personally funded on any level. Now, that being said, just like with my vaccines, there's questionable ingredients in those, but I pay top scientists large amounts of income to produce positive test results, and then I disperse those throughout the global community. And those are magically safe. And like I stated earlier, the model that we use to be productive within the organization and collaborate with other well-known organizations. And we continue this, and then using the eugenics I learned from my father, who had a hand in Planned Parenthood, then we can end world hunger.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. But Bill, you truly are the king of word salad. Thanks for stopping by. And to my loyal fans out there, I'll see you next week. Until then, stay tuned.
Welcome to part 2 of Just a Little Prick, the unauthorized Bill Gates story. Obviously, the term little prick refers to what happens when you have an injection and is naturally in no way meant in a pejorative way. Heaven forbid, if I were to be rude about Mr. Gates, his friends at The Guardian and the BBC would doubtless need to be revived with smelling salts. In the first episode of Just a Little Prick, I dealt with a few of Mr. Gates's connections, aspirations and investments. But I made it clear that he and his wife seem to have one first love: vaccines. Some people love cats, some people like mountain climbing, some people like horse racing, but Bill and Melinda Gates love vaccines. They yearn to inject everyone, and to them vaccines appear to be the eighth wonder of the world. I wouldn't be surprised if they spent their honeymoon watching vaccines being made or watching vaccinations being given to tiny African children. I bet they spend their evenings drooling over vials of vaccines, and at Christmas they probably give each other unusual vaccines which they've found. Unravelling the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and its links with the world of vaccines and vaccinations has taken weeks and given me a headache. Thank heavens there isn't a vaccination yet for headache. Among the many partnerships and so on which the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has developed in recent years, there's one with an organisation called Gavi. Now, Gavi is rather odd in that it's a partnership between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, which is itself very well financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Bank and a variety of other bodies. So, for example, Gavi also has close and loving partnerships with what I think are some of the world's dirtiest, biggest and most disreputable multinational drug companies, including GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer. Perhaps not surprisingly, the organisation Doctors Without Borders has, I think, criticised Gavi, alleging that large multinational drug companies working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put high markups on their prices, and that Gavi spends oodles of money subsidising large companies. One of Gavi's stated aims seemed to be to create a healthy market for vaccines. You'll probably not be surprised to hear that Gates has close links with a number of multinational drug companies, but you may or may not be surprised to hear that he doesn't seem to me to be terribly fussy about the company he keeps. On the other hand, it would, I suppose, be quite difficult to find a drug company partner that didn't have a reputation that would make Al Capone blush with shame. If you get into bed with a drug company, you have to be prepared to wake up in the morning with a bit of scratching and itching and so on. In a previous video entitled "Would You Trust These People with Your Life?", I detailed some of the bad things that GSK has done over recent years, and I pointed out that if it were a human being, GSK would be described as a recidivist. It would probably have regular appointments with a parole officer. GSK is one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies, and in my view, if it made teaspoons, you'd need to be a special sort of person to buy a teaspoon from them. In 2014, for example, GSK was fined $490 million by China after a Chinese court found it guilty of bribery. The court gave GSK's former head of Chinese operation a suspended prison sentence, and they gave suspended prison sentences to other executives too. Sadly, that misadventure in China wasn't GSK's only little "oh dear whoops, how did that happen" mistake. Here are some others. In 2009, in Canada, a 5-year-old girl died 5 days after an H1N1 flu shot, and her parents sued GSK for $4.2 million. The parents' lawyer alleged that the drug was brought out quickly and without proper testing, as the federal government exerted intense pressure on Canadians to get immunised. In 2010, GSK paid out $1.14 billion because of claims over a drug called Paxil, and they settled lawsuits over a drug called Avandia for $500 million. In 2011, GSK paid $250 million to settle 5,500 death and injury claims and set aside $6.4 billion for future lawsuits and settlements in respect of the drug Avandia. And then there are the accusations of fraud, misbranding and failure to report safety data. In 2012, GSK pleaded guilty to federal criminal offences, including misbranding of 2 antidepressants and failure to report safety data about a drug for diabetes to the FDA in America. The company admitted to illegally promoting Paxil for the treatment of depression in children and agreed to pay a fine of $3 billion. GSK also reached a related civil settlement with the US Justice Department. The $3 billion fine also included the civil penalties for improper marketing of half a dozen other drugs. There's more interesting stuff about GSK on my video entitled "Would You Trust These People with Your Life?" Oh, and there's a couple of other things you should know about GSK. First, GSK is one of the top earning vaccine companies in the world, and in 2010 there were reports of narcolepsy occurring in Sweden and Finland among children who had the H1N1 swine flu vaccine. It's reported that not all the safety problems were made public. In Ireland, the Irish government kept inviting people to get vaccinated, even when it was clear that the pandemic was on the wane and it was nowhere near the catastrophe portrayed by influenza researchers, governments, industry and the media. One member of the Irish Parliament told the Irish Prime Minister the Health Service executive decided to purchase Pandemrix and continued to distribute it even after they knew it was dangerous and untested. It's perhaps worth noting that Professor Neil Ferguson, the Eddie the Eagle of mathematical modelling, though perhaps without the innocence and patriotic charm, had predicted that the swine flu could lead to 65,000 deaths in the UK alone. In the end, the swine flu killed 457 people and had a death rate of just 0.026% of those infected. Just another of Ferguson's cock-ups. Cock-ups seem to be a speciality of his in more ways than one. Second, Sir Patrick Vallance is the chief scientific advisor in the United Kingdom and, I suspect, a key figure in dealing with the coronavirus in the UK and plans for a vaccine. Vallance worked for GSK between 2006 and 2018, and by the time he left GSK he was a member of the board and the corporate executive team. Fines and so on, which I've listed, took place while Vallance was working as a senior figure at GSK. As I say, you can find out lots more exciting stuff about GSK and about another drug company in my video entitled "Would You Trust These People with Your Life?" If the video disappears, you can, as always, find the transcript on my website, www.vernoncoleman.com. Oh, and there's one more thing I nearly forgot to mention. GlaxoSmithKline was fined £37.6 million for cheating the National Health Service. I wonder what Vallance thought about that. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also has a relationship with Pfizer, and to be honest with you, Pfizer's record isn't anything you'd want to boast about. If you work there, you'd want to keep quiet about it, I think, and say perhaps that you work for the tax people or rob banks for a living. So, for example, in the UK, Pfizer was fined £84.2 million for overcharging the NHS by 2,600%, and in the United States, Pfizer was hit with a $2.3 billion fine for mispromoting medicines and paying kickbacks to doctors. You might think that a foundation wanting to have a clean reputation might avoid relationships with companies like those. But Bill Gates doesn't seem to mind about all these little peccadillos, the cheating and the deceiving and so on. And in a way, why should he? He's got a team of PR people willing and able to make sure that his halo is constantly being repaired and polished. And I doubt if his many press and broadcasting partners will want to damage their financially advantageous relationship by mentioning anything which might cause embarrassment. After all, we mustn't forget that the foundation he shares with Melinda, Mrs. Gates, seems to me to have investments with much of the world's media, doling out fairly huge chunks of cash to no doubt grateful partners. Did I forget to mention that those two sanctimonious organisations, the BBC and The Guardian, are partners with the Gates Foundation? It cannot be that Gates isn't aware of the problems associated with vaccination because his own foundation has, allegedly, had its own little peccadilloes to think about. I've described some of those controversies in other videos. In India, there was trouble over a Gates-funded vaccine program. A government investigation claimed the program, an observational study, violated the human rights of those being injected and failed to report properly adverse effects. That, as we've seen, is not entirely unusual drug company practice. A parliamentary investigation concluded that the Gates-funded Programme for Appropriate Technology in Health had been engaged in a scheme to help ensure healthy markets for GlaxoSmithKline and Merck, another drug company. An eminent Indian editor said, "It is shocking to see how an American organisation used surreptitious methods to establish itself in India." Another complaint was that Indians were used as guinea pigs. In Africa, a meningitis vaccine project funded by Gates led to reports of up to 500 children allegedly suffering seizures and convulsions and becoming paralysed. And back in India, it was reported that over 490,000 people developed paralysis as a result of the polio vaccine that was given. Remarkably and horrifyingly, it was claimed that 80% of polio cases were derived from the vaccine. There are complaints that the Gates Foundation has taken over public health for the benefit of big drug companies. The links between the Gates Foundation and other organisations and the pharmaceutical giants seem never-ending. Gates has long argued that the world is overpopulated, and to help further this end, the Gates Foundation is said to have funded Mary Stopes, an organisation which performs over 3 million abortions a year, and has also worked with a charity called Genuity, which is experimenting with a second trimester abortion trial in Africa. But it's vaccines which seem to interest Gates most, and despite all the known hazards, the enthusiastic Gates remains gung-ho about vaccines. He must know there are very real dangers with vaccines, but curiously that doesn't seem to worry him. I wonder if he really has any idea what he's talking about when he discusses vaccines. There seems to me to be very little awareness of the risk-benefit ratio. For example, I've seen an interview in which he agrees that if 7 billion people are vaccinated against the coronavirus, there could be 700,000 people damaged by the virus. There could be many deaths, but I don't think Mr. Gates likes to talk about that scenario. He says that there could be 700,000 people with side effects, and he dismisses this as though he's talking about a bit of soreness or a slight rash. Not necessarily so, Mr. Gates. I've been studying and writing about vaccines for 50 years, and the side effects from vaccination are often life-changing. It's perfectly possible, for example, that there could be 700,000 people with severe brain damage after the first tranche of the vaccination program has been completed. I wonder if Gates has any idea what a brain-damaged person looks like, how devastating it is, not just for them, but for their relatives. And of course the COVID-19 disease, the subject of the Gates determination for a global vaccine, has, as I keep reminding everyone, killed far fewer people than the ordinary flu can kill in the same sort of time period. What's all this about? Who's doing what for why, and who's profiting and how? Well, the drug companies are making money, loads of it. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is getting more control over global healthcare, and Bill and Melinda are becoming ever more powerful and ever more able to pursue whatever goals and agendas might be dear to them. And wherever they go, they're treated like royalty. And Bill Gates himself is said to be richer now than he was a decade ago. Indeed, during the decade of vaccines promoted by Gates, his personal worth is said to have doubled to over $100 billion. The bottom line, however, is that I can't help suspecting that if Gates hadn't made so much money and hadn't doled so much of it out to buy influence, everyone would laugh at him, ignore him, or dismiss him as a nutter. Is there a hidden agenda? How much does Gates' fear about overpopulation influence what he does? And how much does that family interest in eugenics affect the aims of the Gates Foundation? Many rich people do wonderful things with their money, but they do it without trying to change the world and without wanting to alter the way people live. Although Gates is a university dropout with no more medical degrees than your fridge, he is regarded as a saviour, and his views on vaccination are treated as though they've been carved in stone and handed down from on high. What Gates wants is what we get. It seems to me that Gates is ignorant, deluded, arrogant and enormously dangerous. In my view, he is doing and will do infinitely more harm than good. And the other half of this strange joke is that whereas, although I'm medically trained and have studied vaccines and vaccination for half a century, my questioning, cautious view, asking only for more medical or scientific evidence to be produced in support of the claims which are made, is regarded as unacceptable, and I'm the one libelled, demonised and dismissed as a nutter, targeted by trolls, demonised as too questioning and regarded as too dangerous to be allowed onto Facebook, lest I terrify the community with too many truths. Putting aside my scepticism and doubts about vaccination and my conviction after much research that vaccines are neither as safe nor as effective as we are assured by their ignorant supporters, I'm deeply concerned about the safety of any coronavirus vaccine. I feel that anyone who accepts a coronavirus vaccine as proposed or supported by Bill Gates or his foundation should perhaps be placed in protective care for their own protection. I pray that no parents will allow their children to be given a vaccine that has been hastily produced and has not been thoroughly tested. Those who believe in vaccination should demand that any vaccines are thoroughly tested for safety and efficiency and that all test results are made public. Still, there's a bright side to all this. When the inevitable biopic of Gates's life is made, I hope they'll use my title, Just a Little Prick. It seems so suitable for a man who appears to be dedicated to vaccinating the world. Thank you for watching An Old Man in a Chair, and thank you for all your support and encouragement. Please copy and share the videos on Twitter and Facebook and BitChute and other platforms. Let's spread the truth. If you'd like to put on a translation, that would be great. If my videos disappear, then please go to my website to find out where you can see them. The transcripts of all my videos, including the banned ones, are always on my website. If you do visit mainstream media, please put on a message asking other people to watch those videos to find the truth. This channel's not been monetized. I haven't authorized any advertising and there's no sponsorship. If you'd like to see more videos from me, then please subscribe to my channel because they're not always easy to find. Although it may feel like it at times, please remember you're not on your own. More and more people are waking up. I firmly believe that together we will win this fight. As far as I know, my health's okay. I try to avoid accidents and I'm not planning to commit suicide. I just thought I'd mention that. Thank you for watching An Old Man in a Chair.
Ramped up very quickly in a few countries that have almost avoided the epidemic entirely, like Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia. You know, they took their experience and actually prepared, and so they moved a lot faster. So we, we'll have to prepare for the next one. That, I'd say is will get attention this time.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a plan! Now, if this global reinvention is to work, there might be a few competitors that are unfortunately eliminated! Oopsie!
Oh, behave.
This world is not what you think it is. This world is not what you think it is.